let's begin with this, the 2024 election, which I think was remarkable in so many ways, given recent political history, where Democrats had basically an automatic lock on, certainly at the managerial level of labor unions. Labor leaders were automatically supportive of the Democratic Party, largely because the union they represented was as well. And yet, in this particular case, we saw the largest labor union, the Teamsters Union, and its president not only refused to endorse the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris, but he went and spoke at the Republican National Convention in a primetime slot, heaped a lot of praise on not just Donald Trump, but other Republican senators who are trying to position themselves as kind of pro-union, pro-working class. Rightly or wrongly, people like Josh Hawley and his running mate, J.D. Vance, who the Teamster president said had done a lot for labor unions to stand by them. And then, of course, we saw a lot of working class voters continue to migrate away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. What do you make of this? Clearly, what is a shift in the political allegiances of not just working class voters, but also labor unions themselves?
Yes, it's a big question. It's an important question. I think the major story here is that the Democrats are reaping what they've sowed for over 40 years of neoliberal policies, going back to Carter's austerity, Clinton's NAFTA, Obama's bank bailouts. Working class people have not been benefiting from the Democratic Party for a very long time now. So the allegiances that were built up over previous generations, because the Democrats had delivered big under the New Deal, have been fraying for a long time. So this process of sort of disillusionment is not new, but it has reached a different stage. And clearly the crisis of the Democratic Party with unions is very acute. And we saw that with Sean O'Brien speaking at the RNC, and we see more generally with a lot of working class voters, including union voters, voting for Trump. On the whole, union members still disproportionately voted for the Democrats, and had more workers been members of unions, Harris probably would have won. Unfortunately, only 10% of the workforce are members of unions. So, this was not able to deliver the election. But the general trend is still very, very, very bad for the Democratic Party. I think that on the one hand, it's a positive thing for unions to be breaking their deferential ties to the Democrats. That sort of policy of backroom dealing and sort of blind allegiance has led labor largely to its crisis, where you have so few workers in unions. On the other hand, I think we should be real. I don't think there's much there to, the populist rhetoric of the Republicans and on union policies. There is actually a frank difference. The Republicans have been worse, continue to be worse on unions specifically. Just like to give one example, the first move of the Trump administration on the NLRB, which governs labor law in the U.S., the National Labor Relations Board, was to appoint just a management hack, a guy named Marvin Kaplan, to the position. This is a guy who just always sides with business over labor. So this is a very, very tricky situation, because neither party, frankly, is representing working class people, and unions are trying to figure out what to do. I think it's good to try experimenting, but I'm very skeptical. I haven't seen much evidence that the Republicans are actually going to deliver pro-worker or pro-union policies.
Yeah, it remains to be seen. I want to delve into that a little bit more. But before we get to that, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, it always seems in politics like things that we talk about as though they're new are actually things that we've seen in the past that a lot of people just didn't live through or had forgotten about. I remember very well, not that well, I was very young, not to age myself too much, but in the 1980 election, and then throughout the Reagan years, especially 1984, when he won that resounding victory, that sweeping victory over Walter Mondale, this phrase emerged that people were referred to as Reagan Democrats. And it basically meant people in the heartland who had typically voted for Democrats, were part of the generation or grew up with the generation that revered FDR and the New Deal and the sorts of things that the Democratic Party was perceived to have done for people who weren't wealthy in the United States. And it created this affinity with the Democratic Party. And yet there were a lot of union members, a lot of people who were working class who abandoned the Democratic Party, and they loved Ronald Reagan. As someone who's a historian as well of the labor movement, what is it that caused that, and is that similar to what's taking place now?
Yeah, I mean, the pattern isn't new. The pattern is something that we have had for a very long time in the US, which is because we have a two-party system and because we have a political system dominated by big business, working people, frankly, get thrown around a lot and get their hopes raised and get their hopes dashed by a lot of different parties, including Reagan. So, Reagan was a union member famously. He was a part of the Hollywood union, and a lot of unions thought he was going to be their champion. And by the end of the Reaganomics experiment, a lot of those same, Reagan Democrats were disillusioned and they voted for Clinton. And then Clinton goes ahead and passes the worst free trade agreement. So the basic pattern is both parties failing to deliver, and then workers sometimes forgetting these lessons or trying to see, well, at least these people who are out of power, if we put them in, maybe they won't be as bad as the last round. And so it is really sort of a very vicious cycle in which unions haven't found a way to sort of either force either party to consistently stand with them or to raise a more independent voice. So I think what you're saying is exactly right. There's plenty of previous examples, particularly white workers, but not just, siding with the Republicans. But, on the whole, this hasn't resulted in a major realignment of either parties towards working class or union interests.
I remember something from the 2016 campaign that always stayed with me, because it seems so illustrative of how politics works in so many ways. Hillary Clinton she didn't visit many states, but one of the states she did visit for whatever reasons was West Virginia. And she was speaking to coal workers and the coal jobs in West Virginia that had always been so crucial to that state's economy were disappearing. And she basically told them, I guess being honest, actually, look, get over it. It's not, these jobs aren't coming back. We're moving to a different kind of an economy, a greener economy. Coal is not part of the future. And about 3 weeks later, Donald Trump came to West Virginia and said exactly the opposite. He said, we're going to save your coal jobs. We know that you're suffering. You've been deindustrialized. He blamed NAFTA and the Clintons. And he said, we're going to bring back your coal jobs. And then I remember a group of coal miner workers being interviewed by media and were asked about that, and they were asked, do they believe Trump when he says we're going to bring your jobs back? And they basically said, no, actually I don't really believe him, but at least he is speaking to our problem. He's recognizing what we're going through, and he's not just telling us to get over it. And it created this kind of affinity for Trump, because I do think people want to feel like they're being cared about and seen. And at the same time, the Democratic Party with Chuck Schumer saying things like, yeah, for every working class voter that we lose, we're going to pick up 2 affluent suburbanite voters, and it's going to all balance out, and we're going to win anyway. It seems like on some level, Democrats have in part taken for granted these working class voters, but also have considered them kind of dispensable. And people perceive that. They're not dumb, especially when it comes to their own lives. Is that something you think that has been going on in terms of the alienation of some working class voters away from the Democratic Party?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly the case. And I would just say that, generally speaking, Trump is very smart and actually has a better read, I think, on the extent of anger and disillusionment and anxiety and insecurity of working class people of all backgrounds, frankly, in the U.S. And he's able to speak to that. And so people feel heard. Again, I don't think there's much substance to it. I don't, based on his last record. But I think what you pinpoint is real, is that unlike the Democrats, Trump has been able to very explicitly articulate and name and sort of say he's hearing working class people. And that, after you feel like you've been ignored for decades, then yeah, it's understandable why people would respond positively to that, even if they haven't seen the policy changes in their lives. At least it feels like somebody up there is listening, right? And the Democrats haven't done themselves any favors by this, frankly, and it's really, it's in some ways baffling that they've given the mantle of anti-establishment working class politics to the Republicans, and then the Democrats paint themselves as the defender of the status quo. And that makes sense if you're doing well, and it makes sense if you're a billionaire. It makes sense maybe even if you're like a upper middle class person doing basically fine. But there's just a huge chasm with working class people who don't feel like they're doing fine, who feel like they're struggling to get by. And whichever party is able to sort of speak to that and give it a political voice is going to do well electorally. And I think we're seeing that over the last few years.
You referenced this a little bit earlier, but I just want to drill down a little bit on it. There are a lot of left-wing critics of the Democratic Party who really have become completely soured on Democratic Party politics for a lot of the reasons you just said. Think their funding and arming and unconditional support for the war in Gaza would open a lot of people's eyes to what the Democratic Party really is. A lot of people think that Joe Biden was a disaster. The Democratic Party itself is something that can be reformed. And yet, even those people, the harshest critics I know on the left of Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, will acknowledge that one of the areas, I mean, for me, one of the best things he did was Lena Khan and the FTC. But a lot of people will say, actually, even better, were his labor board picks, the Labor Relations Board, and a lot of these kind of old school pro-union policies. I heard someone this week say that they think the reason for that is that Joe Biden is just so old that he comes from that era when the Democratic Party was still kind of consciously pro-union. There's just parts of like his DNA and his brain that just those neural connections happen. He's like, no, we're the party that's pro-union, and it was just kind of an aberration. But whatever is true, there is some truth to that for sure, and yet it doesn't really seem to have registered a lot or mattered. It registered with union officials, people who pay very close attention to those sort of things, but working class voters as a whole, even union members, it doesn't seem to have had that much of an impact. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so there's two things there. One is I don't think Biden's pro-union policies had that much to do with his age, because frankly, Biden was VP under Obama, which was not a particularly pro-union administration, and Biden hasn't been notably sort of pro-union in this vociferous way, which he actually was the last few years. So I think the explanation is pretty simple, which is that Bernie Sanders ran and almost won the nomination, and they had to make some concessions to the left, and part of the concessions to the left were the nominations for Lena Khan, but then also Jennifer Abruzzo to head the National Labor Relations Board. And just frankly, the Biden NLRB has been amazing. It's been literally the best NLRB since the 1930s. And it has made a big difference for workers who are trying to unionize. And so the Starbucks campaign, the Amazon workers, the United Auto workers, frankly, for them, it has made a big difference, and which is part of the reason why, for instance, the auto workers, even the rank and file, tended to vote for Harris. Okay, that being said, the big story still is just too little, too late. It hasn't made up for the overall sort of cost of living crisis. It hasn't made up for decades of sort of neoliberal politics. And there's an additional thing which I would add, which is that, frankly, unions didn't seize the opening that Biden gave them. So I'm all for blaming the Democrats as much as anybody else, but there's a certain amount of, and actually a major amount of, blame to be laid on the doorstep of the labor movement as well, because the Biden NLRB created this great opening for potentially unionizing millions more members. And if union density stays at 10%, well, then it's understandable why pro-union policies aren't going to be a decisive impact on the presidential election, because just the vast majority of workers aren't in unions. So what do you do? Well, the labor movement has to grow. The labor movement literally has to organize millions and millions, tens of millions more workers. And that in turn really would have a profound impact on the overall political dynamic in the US. But instead of doing that, in part, unions have been so used to just backroom dealing with Democrats and sort of deference to Democrats, they've fallen out of the tradition of new organizing. They haven't invested in new organizing, even though they have $38 billion in net assets. And so they just blew the opportunity, frankly. Rank and file workers from below sort of seized the moment. That's what my new book's about. But the vast majority of labor unions did exactly what they were doing before, which was just sort of backroom wheeling and dealing. They didn't grow. And so it's not surprising then that they weren't able to deliver a major electoral win to the Democrats, their preferred candidate.
Let me ask you to get back to that topic that I said we're going to get to in just a little bit, which was your view that I think a lot of people share, that although Donald Trump is a very skilled politician, I think we can all acknowledge that at this point, finally, at least with respect to a lot of things, including, as you said, making working class voters feel like he connects to them and understands them. I remember when I was living in New York, before I was a journalist, I was a lawyer, and I remember one time, I don't know why this stuck with me, Donald Trump obviously was a huge cultural figure, tabloid figure in New York City, and I remember he once went to a construction site, and that was a big part of his business, was building buildings, so he was around construction workers a lot, and he went to this construction site, and afterward, he said, yeah, when I go to these construction sites, the guys with the hard hats all scream my name, and that to me is the most valuable kind of fame. Not that when you're known by DC insiders and kind of New York elites, but when sort of the average American, the working class American knows you, I think he's, had this ability to maintain these connections and present that way for a long time. Maybe some of it's genuine because of outer borough resentment, growing up in Queens and feeling that kind of resentment, whatever it is. Yes, that kind of Nixon anti-establishment or kind of resentment toward the establishment ethos that I think helps in this regard. But to me, it seems like there's at least some part of the Republican Party which is trying in a more substantive way to get out of Reaganomics, the idea that the only thing the Republican Party is supposed to do is help corporate profit and corporate power at the expense of working class people. It was Josh Hawley who was the only one who stood with Bernie Sanders to veto the COVID relief bill because it had no direct payments to American workers, and then Trump vetoed it because the payments weren't high enough. J.D. Vance is a huge fan of Lena Khan, has often spoke about that. So is Matt Gaetz. So is Hawley. They speak about the future of the Republican Party being a multiracial working class coalition, which is language totally anathema to the Republican Party. And I think in politics, sort of the more the more voters of a certain kind you attract, the more compelled you feel to service them in order to keep them, in order to kind of placate them. Whereas if they're just your enemies and never going to vote for you, you kind of turn away from them. Do you see any prospect, and I know it's ingrained in so much of us to believe the Republican Party couldn't possibly ever do this, that the Republican Party could actually, following the lead of some of the people I just mentioned, start to be more genuine and not just rhetorical and political in their appeal to working class voters?
Yeah, it's a good question. I will say that it's very hard to predict the future. So I know just as much as you do as far as what's going to happen. I think there's very little evidence yet that minority wing, which you're right, does exist, will have the potential avenue to become hegemonic in the Republicans. And so just to give you a couple examples, look at the Trump's inauguration, right? Like look who is standing with him. These are some of the worst union busters in the whole country. Bezos, Amazon, Elon Musk is literally suing to overturn the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act. So the people who are in a decisive position of influence at this point are literally the billionaires who would stand to lose the most from mass unionization, and who are not just rhetorically but actively, as we speak, doing the most to try to destroy unions. Amazon is the worst union buster in the country. So given the influence that these folks, particularly Elon Musk, have within the administration, that's the hegemonic position right now. There is not like an ambiguity as far as what the overall position of this administration is towards labor. Could it change? Well, I would say it would be great. I would love to see a world in which Republicans pass labor law reform and provide some benefits to union workers. I think it's possible that they would do that in a sort of nativist exclusionary way, which could really divide the working class and be problematic in some ways. But frankly, I just think there's not much evidence of this happening yet, because what you would have to do in order to overcome such powerful influences within the Republican Party is essentially get rid of the influence of the billionaire class within this party, which has it on full lockdown right now. So, good luck to them if they can do that. I think that people like Bernie Sanders and others would like to, get whatever votes they can get from the Republican side for pro-worker policies. But just to give one last example, you can look at the way the vote went down for the NLRB just, a few weeks ago. There was a vote to maintain a pro-union NLRB, would maintain the current appointees, essentially a majority pro-union, and every single Republican voted against it, and it ended up losing because Manchin and Sinema ended up voting against it. Well, not a single Republican was willing to vote for the pro-union NLRB, and so to me, this is indicative just of the balance of forces. Could that change down the road? Yeah, maybe. It seems to me, far less likely than within the Democrats, for all of their limitations. Overwhelmingly, -2 people voted for a pro-union NLRB. So just, the evidence we have as far as the relative influence of pro-union forces within these two parties, both of which are dominated by capital, is pretty clear. So I don't really see why we would expect the Republicans more than the Democrats to, eventually become a pro-worker party.
Yeah, that makes sense. But let me just ask, though, that it seems to me like when we talk about working class voters, the working class in general, there are two very significant changes from how we used to talk about working class voters, say, decades ago. One is that, as you pointed out, only a small percentage of Americans belong to a union now. I think previously when we talked about working class voters, maybe in the working class in the 50s and 60s, it was almost synonymous with labor unions. Working class voters were largely union members. Now there's a huge number of working class voters who are not part of labor unions. And so maybe it's possible to attract working class voters even while still not being particularly pro-union or even actively opposed to unions, as you said. And then the other part of it was, and you alluded to this as well, is that I think when we talked about working class voters for decades, we pretty much were referring to the white working class. And the working class was largely composed of the white working class. Now it is very multiracial. There's a huge number of black working class voters, and Latino working class voters, and Asian working class voters, and Muslim working class voters. And this is a big part of what we saw in the shift from Democrats to Republicans. Is not just white working class voters, but working class voters of every different racial group and minority group. So is it possible to envision a party that is pro-working class without necessarily being pro-union, especially given, as you document in your book, that the percentage of unions has reduced pretty significantly for a lot of reasons?
Well, I mean, it depends on what your analysis of U.S. society is. Basically, if you think that it's possible to sort of systematically raise the living standards and make lives better for working class people without challenging the power of capital, well, then yes, and I think that this is the hope of certain wings of the Republicans, is that there's a way to sort of coexist with the billionaires while providing maybe some more welfare state benefits. And, you don't even necessarily, as you mentioned, need to be pro-union. Maybe you can get some more manufacturing. I think the essential problem just in that power analysis is that experience has shown that in order to really significantly improve, working conditions and living conditions, the major block for that is the power of capital, right? The corporate sort of just dominance over everything is what is blocking that. And so the question is, how would you overcome that resistance? Maybe you could do that purely electorally. There's not that much experience to suggest that's the case. Historically, and I think still today, the major mechanism to overcome corporate resistance so that you can pass all these good things, right? So you can force politicians to pass good policies despite sort of like big business, scaring them that they're going to get, primaried out by, some well-funded challenger. The way you do that is by organizing working class people, and that's what unions are. So, if other people share a different analysis, my starting point, and I think there's a lot of good empirical evidence for that, is that workers and bosses have different interests, and therefore it's not actually possible to be consistently pro-worker if you're not pro-union. And so that's a contradiction, I think, that the Republicans have. And I think that, frankly, if a politician, wants to be serious about supporting working class people, then you can't do that and say you're also opposed to unions. To me, that seems like a contradiction in terms. But clearly, some workers disagree. There's plenty of workers out there who voted for Trump.
That just has the last
and
question.
You're right. So that's true. It's possible. Yeah, it's possible that they'll be able to keep on sort of winning people over rhetorically and through some different policies. But I don't think that would lead to the type of transformation in their lives that you could have if it was combined with a real challenge against the billionaires and through a pro-union approach.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.